The Canadian Armed Forces. What are the differences between men and women in the military? I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. Today we're joined by a very special guest and we have a cool topic. We're going to be talking about gender differences. So before we get too far ahead, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Charlotte Duval-Lantoine. I'm a master's student in the Department of History at Queen's University, and I'm also the project manager at the Gender Lab, which is a research subsection at the Center for International and Defense Policy. And the Gender Lab's research currently focuses on the gender differences between men and women transitioning out of the military.
That's really cool. And that's actually where I want to start our conversation, talking about transitioning out of the military. So the first thing I want to ask you is, what are some of the general challenges that both men and women face? And after that, I want to hone in on the specific issues that face women.
So yeah, actually, because they're both in the same organization, men and women face a lot of similar challenges. And what I've noticed is the loss of community. This is a big one for them,
Mhm.
because because a lot of them, at least the people that we've interviewed through focus group, a lot of them have entered the Canadian military when they were 17, and they exited because of medical discharge or other reasons. Their transition is not necessarily voluntary, and what happens is that they feel abandoned because once they're no longer in the armed forces, the organization or the institution, they feel like doesn't care about them anymore.
That's really
And
interesting, actually. I want to bring up one thing very quickly. As I'm hearing this, it brings to mind, it feels like men in the army, they have a sense of brotherhood, you know? Even when they leave the army, that community that you mentioned, I feel like it's very intact. They have a certain bond. Do you think women might have a different setup over there? Maybe that's contributing to this lack of community?
so actually, no. What I've seen is that the loss of community is experienced kind of the same way as women. By women, I'm sorry. The Because these women serve mostly in the same capacities. Obviously, women remain a minority in the Canadian forces, but the ones who serve form the same bonds with their male counterparts or their co-service members. What is interesting, though, is that it's not always women having strong tie with women. You also have service women and women veterans having very strong tie with their male counterparts. And this is where we see the tension, is that there is a certain tension in terms of relationship between service women. Some of them are very supportive of one another, and others are more outwardly in competition. And that would depend on the circumstances in which they served, whether or not they were mothers, whether or not they were single mom, whether or not they had a military spouse, or they were in a two military couple, things like that. But the community, the camaraderie is the same.
That's very interesting, actually, to point out that the competition among women might be so fierce that they have a trouble making those female to female bonds. Do you think that's because of the environment of the Canadian Armed Forces, or is it something deeper than that?
So honestly, I think it is more the environment. People tend to make more general comments saying that women are the harshest critics of women, but to backtrack that a bit and to talk about myself, and it's gonna be connected. You will understand it.
Yep.
I'm a boxer.
Oh,
I've
nice.
been boxing for 3 years, and at my gym, we were not a lot of women. And some of the guys were very competitive and were mocking us, but our coaches were so empowering, were helping us so much that instead of being competitive, even though we were actually punching each other across the face, our goal was not to dominate one another. We
Mhm.
were there to empower each other, and every time a person would throw a big blow in my face, I would be like, whoa, that was freaking nice, right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of And I see that in other environments than the military, is that when an environment pushes people for competition, when the environment tends to be, and I will throw a big word, but toxic,
Mhm.
there seems to be a higher rates of competition and toxicity among the minority group,
Yeah, that
because they try to prove themselves and make it into the in group.
yeah, that makes sense. And I want to tie things back to the original question of when people are transitioning out of the Canadian Armed Forces, what other challenges do men or even women face when they're going through that?
So the differences are, I know it more statistically, but women face higher rates of homelessness. They have higher rates of developing PTSD. And when I say that, is that women have higher rates of leaving the military on medical discharge. That means that the military says you have to leave because you're not suitable for service anymore. And it is the same thing with physical injuries. Also, because women are generally, by gender role, the caregivers and the person that runs the household, they tend not to work after their release, because they feel like they have so much to do. And when they come, if they decide to come back to work, they have a lower income than their male counterparts, and the difference is about 21%.
That's interesting. And I actually want to ask about something you mentioned a little bit before, the discharge rates. That's so interesting to me because I'm putting myself in someone's shoes. Let's say you really want to be in the military, that's your career. You take pride in being a member, and all of a sudden you're being told that you're no longer suitable and you have to retire. It's pretty disheartening. And I want to ask, why do you think that women have a higher rate of being discharged? Is it because they're getting injured at higher rates, or is it something else?
It is because they're getting injured at higher rates, and you have to think about it. So right now, the physical standards, uniforms, and equipment in the Canadian Armed Forces are what they call gender-free or gender-neutral. When they say gender-free and gender-neutral, is that it is adapted to men. It is to match men's capabilities and physical needs and physical characteristics. But it is known that women have lower upper body strength, but stronger lower body strength. And for example, training does not develop that specific strength in women. Same thing, men have higher explosive power, women are more endurance. Once again, basic training does not cover it. And then you have problems of uniforms not matching the rucksack, which is a big backpack that you have to carry very heavy load, that is not adapted for women's physiology. So it puts a strain on their hips, which means that they will develop musculoskeletal injuries at higher rates. The shoes are not adapted either. There's a bunch of things like that that makes women more likely to develop an injury during service and then having to be medically released.
There seems to be two issues here identified. One is more so the equipment side of things, and the other might be more the physical capabilities and specializing, making people play to their strengths. So in terms of the equipment, I think that's a good place to start, making sure that the boots and the backpacks are well equipped for women's bodies. But when it comes to something like physical capability, how would you go about resolving that?
So there are two problems to be had here: adapting training and making men accept that the training cannot be the same and that the physical requirements cannot be the same. It's been like that since the 1990s, which is a period that I study for my master's research.
Mm-hmm.
From the very start, when women were allowed to fight in combat, to be part of combat roles, men saw any differences of treatment, whether it was negative, positive, or neutral, to be favoritism. For example, there was a program called Clothe the Soldier, which was considering developing a combat bra for women, or having uniforms that actually fit women and that would lower the rates of eating disorders among women because the sizes of military uniforms were not matching civilian sizes. So women that would wear 14 in civilian sizes will wear 20 in military sizes. So men would see that. Also, any change of physical standard, men considered it to be lowering the standards. So there is the need of listening to the research, where it's like, so how can we make women stronger and more apt to face combat arms? Because there's a lot of women that are willing to do so, but they are afraid, and they are aware of the limitation. And also there's a lot of women who try to go into that field that cannot pass the physical test. Why is that? Is this because the training is not adapted? Is it because there are social and societal barriers for women to train as much as men when they are in their mid-teens? So there is that. And also we're lacking research on women's strength, especially in heavy lifting. And then there is, how do we make everyone accept that we're different sexes biologically, we are different genders? How do we adapt to that? Yeah. Equal treatment doesn't mean it is fair.
Exactly. I 100% agree with everything you just said. That was very beautifully put. I want to touch on the social aspect of that because it's very interesting. Everything you said, I believe, is correct. Men and women are biologically suited to different things, and as a result, you will need tailored approaches to maximizing the output from these two different groups of people. But being different doesn't mean one's inferior to the other, and that's a key point to keep in mind. It seems like in today's day and age, though, there might be a dichotomy of confusion. On one side, you have a lot of activists nowadays who are openly saying men, women, equals, biologically the same, treat them exactly the same. But to me, that's kind of confusing because that'll be accepted as the socially correct norm. But when we look at the stats and the data and real life examples, it is clear that there has to be a tailored approach for both. So what do you think about that?
Personally, I don't think that we're the same, but I think we're equal.
Exactly.
That is the thing, right? Like,
exactly. Yes.
Also back to my own experience as a boxer, I see myself to be as capable as other men, but like I cannot punch them because they're heavier than me, not because they're men, right?
Yes.
It's that. And so I don't like the idea that equal treatment means that everyone should be treated the same. And it's the same thing with that idea that stems are superior to humanities and other stuff. We have that way in our society of putting everything in a hierarchy, and we decide what is best. But we need to be more embracing of, no, we're different, we have different skills, and this is why we need to embrace all of them on an equal foot if we want to advance and be better at stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you 100%. And I'm glad you said that because that's really the core message here. And I want to ask, before I move on to talking about the veteran workshops that you guys have, is there anything else you found interesting when doing your research about transitioning out of the military?
Yeah, and it is something that I may explore as an article if I happen to have the time. It is the idea that service members see themselves as the meat in a meat grinder when they are serving.
Okay.
I think it was a very interesting thing of observing because so mainly it's men using that expression, meat as in a meat grinder. I never heard that before. It was the first time I heard this, and I was like, whoa, this is gruesome.
Yes, for real.
So they see themselves as just being a pawn for the organization to do whatever the organization has to do. So there seems to be a loss of self-efficacy among these men, just saying themselves as disposable, that gets emphasized when you transition out of the military, because suddenly you're out of the organization and you lose all the support that you had. And when I talk about support, it's not only community, but for example, some men and also women were saying that in the military, they give you your doctor's appointment. They tell you when to go to the dentist. So that is a lot of like nurturing that is happening there. So everything is handed to them. And then you lose that when you get out of the organization. So you can see that there's a loss of self-efficacy. By self-efficacy here, I mean like their self-perception of performing well, of being a valuable member of society, etc. So to me, that is a sign of an organization that might be toxic when you see yourself as nothing but a tool.
Yes.
But at the same time, there is that very interesting perception of seeing themselves as superior to civilian world, where they see themselves as more, they call it regimented, I would say better organized, more structured. They know what they want in life, and when they want to get something done, they do it,
Yeah,
and
and
they don't postpone it. And so they see themselves as superior to civilian based on that. So there is that tension here where it's like, well, what is all, it might bring questions more about socialization once you get into the military, but then that socialization impacts, and your military life impacts how you see yourself once you are a veteran.
yes, and I really want to expand on that a little bit more because it's interesting. This sort of superiority they feel when they're serving, as you said, they feel like they're on a pedestal compared to civilians. It is indefinitely going to be a short-lived feeling because, as we both know, you can't be in the military forever. There will come a time where you do have to retire or be discharged, and I guess there might be a challenge there, trying to go from that superior mindset to mingling with civilians. You yourself become a civilian, but you once regarded them as being inferior in a sense. How much of a challenge is that mentally?
So interesting. To them, they don't become a civilian. They're a veteran now. They're something else.
Oh, wow. Okay.
They understand that they have to adapt to civilian society, but there's a lot of frustration that civilians don't want to adapt to their own ways as well, right? So they still see, and this is the hard part because you're no longer military, but you've never been a civilian for a lot of them because they joined when they were 17, or if not younger, because some of them were young cadets, right?
Hmm.
So it is all of that tension, and there is a woman veteran. Her name is Hélène Le. She's studying at Carleton, if I am right. She's in Ottawa, but she's doing her PhD in the loss of identity when you become a veteran. And she looks at it based on her own experience because she had to be medically discharged after she started developing PTSD, and she was in the combat arms. So I'm looking forward to her own research because she started, but it was very interesting how she explores having to weave all of those identities, because even though you leave the military, you're still that person. You're still that person that was socialized a certain way, that learned to work in a certain way, learned to be in a certain way for most of their lives, for a lot of them. And so how to weave these identities together in order to adapt to civilian life is complicated, but also, to me, it brings also the question, what can us civilians do to adapt to them? Because culture adaptation shouldn't go just one way.
Yeah, and that's all really good. This is actually the perfect segue because I do want to spend some time now talking about the workshops that you guys host, because you guys do a lot of great work too, helping veterans transition.
Yeah, so it started with the current research project that we're doing. It's a parallel. So it was created by Megan Shoemaker, who is a PhD student at Queen's, but had to step down as a project manager because she's also working full-time at the Department of National Defense now, while finishing her PhD. So it's been a lot for her. But in 2016, she decided to give more to the community. So since then, every year we have the Veteran Transition Workshop, which focuses on discussing the gender dimension of transition. That is to say, what are the specific challenges that women face? What are the specific challenges that men face? And also looking at the services that women have. And it is something that I haven't mentioned before, but there are less available services for women specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a big gap that civil society is trying to fill right now, and the Veterans Affairs Canada is showing that they're trying to listen now. So that is good. But back to the workshop takes place over a day and a half. You have a conference that I'm organizing right now. It's full day of panel, like the regular thing. Usually it's academics that present the research on what are once again, the gender dimension of veteran transition. This year, I want to do things a little bit differently and really listen to people on the ground, because we all, as academics, because we want to publish and because of what is available to us to access, we tend to focus on the same themes, which are medical discharge and professional development. But I want to see what is lacking, what we're not looking at. So this time I want to look at positive experiences of transition to finally find, what makes that transition positive. Was it because people had planned more ahead, because they were empowered by civil societies, because their family was there, because they had a strong military community to help them, a few things like that. Then I want to look into intersectionality. What is the experience of people of color? What is the experience of Aboriginal service members? All of that. And also another one is that how can civil society can better help veterans? So that would be a discussion between veterans and organization on what they do and what could be done better. So having a really true conversation is what I want. And the last one is the experiences of family members of veterans. What is their experience of transition? Because we don't look at it that way, but these people are also really part of military life. Their career impacted, their schooling is impacted. So there's a lot of that to unpack. So that will be this year's conference side of the workshop, but the workshop also includes a mentoring program for women, for service women or women in transition, for service women in transition and women veterans. It's for them to find someone that can help them ease their transition, or maybe, sometimes just find someone to talk to when they're not doing great. That mentorship program takes place over an afternoon mostly, and it also includes small workshops within them where we teach them some things to increase their self-efficacy. And this year we're gonna do how to be a mentor and how to be a good mentee and networking. And we're gonna have people facilitating the creation of these mentorship relationships.
Yeah, and that's really great stuff. I like where you guys are coming from. Now, I kind of want to shift our attention to, we talked about veterans a lot. I want to talk about the current state of the Canadian Armed Forces. I found some really cool data online that I want to share with you and get your thoughts. The first thing I came across was based on the Government of Canada website. They lay out that the goal they have within the armed forces is to have 1 in 4 members being women. Doesn't an idea like that matter? Or would it be better to naturally let the numbers play out without arbitrary quotas? What do you think about that?
So first of all, I want to emphasize the fact that there are no quotas. They want to reach a certain amount of service women, but there are no quotas. They don't have any targets of recruitment for women. So basically, it doesn't change much. They're trying to better target their recruiting campaigns and improve retention. That is to say, incentivize service women to stay longer in the military. That being said, being very familiar with the history of the Canadian Armed Forces and their process of what we call gender integration, is the fact that they won't reach that goal by 2025, as they had said. My research focuses on my own personal research, not the Gender Lab this time. I study gender integration starting from 1989, which is the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal decision for the Canadian Armed Forces to reach, and I quote, full integration. In 1989, there were 9.9% of women in the Canadian forces. In 1999, which was the deadline at which the Canadian Armed Forces had to reach full gender integration, was 10.8% of service women. There was an increase of 0.9%, and that was mainly because men left the Canadian Armed Forces at greater numbers.
Yes, it's interesting because I think this point about quotas, I want to talk more about that because to me, there seems there's a big distinction here. There is a difference in a sense from the government saying we would like more women in our force, but to give a number to it and to make it a goal, it does come off as a sort of quota. And there's one more thing I want to touch on too. It's the fact that it seems kind of arbitrary. This number, 1 in 4. Why not 1 in 5? Why not 2 in 4? You know what I mean? It
Yeah, no, actually, this is a discussion that I've had this past October 2018, when I was at the Inter-University Symposium. We had, which is a conference about people engaged in all topics concerning the armed forces and society.
Mhm.
So it is a Canadian and American conference.
Yep.
What we had a roundtable on the diversity strategy in the Canadian Armed Forces, and my supervisor happened to have brought up that question: why 25%? Why does it matter? And we had that very interesting, I want to put it in quotes,
Mhm.
conversation with the person that came up with that number at the Defense Research and Development agency within it's called the RDC. It's a lot of acronyms and I never know them by heart.
Mhm.
And I'm sorry about that, but I know it's it's Defense Research and Development Canada. Anyway, he was saying that he came from calculations of what they believed would make women no longer marginalized in the Canadian Armed Forces based on calculations of the rates of integration of women in the workplace.
Mhm. Okay, I
So,
see.
so it is very complex calculation, and not being good at math, and that discussion happening back in October, it was complicated.
I'll take your word for it. It definitely does sound complicated. There's one.
It's a very sociological question. And to go back to your issue of perceptions of quota and whether or not it's fair to have this number as a target and whether it's going to be effective, one, establishing numbers is ineffective if we don't look at the effectiveness of that integration. I
Agreed.
truly don't believe, and it is a very good feminist term, but I don't believe that adding women in STIR is enough. Adding women in STIR is just encouraging women to join the armed forces and not changing any of the policies,
Mhm.
which what has happened most of the time. And when we talk about armed forces saying that they have improved their policies vis-a-vis women, it's mostly for maternity leave and sexual harassment,
Yes, yes.
which are just one part of gendered issues that women face when they are in the military, but it's not enough.
Yeah.
And so the Canadian Armed Forces, in order not to have that perception of a quota, even though it's difficult when you just name numbers, is that they want to improve recruitment of women by encouraging them. They want women to come on their own accords, basically. But the problem is that they're still not doing it the right way. I don't know if you've seen very recently, there was frequent FAQ, frequently asked questions about women in the military. And the first question was, can I wear makeup in the Canadian military?
No way. That's
It
crazy.
was that, and a lot of women were mad. They were like, are you kidding me? If I join the military, it's not to wear makeup. But myself, I've encountered at many defense and security conferences where I have service member, hey, you're a woman, you're interested in defense and security. Or sometimes they're just saying, oh, you're a woman, want to join the armed forces?
Mhm.
Thank you for appreciating me for my skills and my knowledge.
Exactly.
You
Yeah,
know,
that
and
definitely has
and
the
it's
interest.
and it's also because and there's a problem is that by putting up these numbers as a target, these target numbers, women when they are recruited, they feel like they're just a number.
Mhm.
And also because their peer service members, especially servicemen, think that these women are just numbers and are not have not been recruited because of the capabilities and the competencies, it makes their integration difficult. And another note on that is that the fact that we think that we integrate women just by numbers, it says a lot about our assumptions about women competencies and capabilities. From the straight point, every time a woman attains an exceptional position in the armed forces, it's because when they get promoted, it's because they have done fantastic work, amazing. And sometimes there are some people be like, but is she good for the job?
Yes, I agree with you 100%. And that's one of the problems that we have to tackle. It's funny because you kind of alluded to it. That's one of the issues with a quota because it does bring you down to a number. I want to change quickly to something called Operation Honor, though. And you touched on that as well, talking about the sexual misconduct that occurs in the military. So, Operation Honor, for the audience who may not be aware, was launched in 2015. And it's really a mission to eliminate sexual misconduct and to ensure a professional work environment free from harassment and discrimination. How do you think these stigmas of sexual misconduct affect women's perceptions of the armed forces, and to what extent does it make them weary of even joining?
So I have a lot of thoughts on Operation Honor. But to start with your question, is it acts as a deterrent. And for having studied different armed forces as part of a NATO project that I am a research assistant for, Canada has a problem, a very specific problem surrounding that. And so women are scared, and who wouldn't be? If you say to people, oh, I want to join the military, but the only reply you get is, be careful, you might get raped. You need to protect yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It is highly problematic. And so, of course, it acts as a deterrent. Would you join the military if they told you might get raped there?
Probably not. And actually, I want to just add one more thing before you carry on, just to give the audience an idea of how bad the issue is. So according to Stats Canada, more than 25% of women reported being a victim of sexual assault during their military career. So it's not just a small minority, it's a wide problem.
Oh yeah, it is pervasive, and it has been going on for a long time. It is also part of my research, but I have a colleague that is at Queen's University as well. She's exploring that in deeper ways. But when you look at the history of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, it's not the first. 2014 and 2015 was not the first time they had a scandal. In 1999, there were 3 cover letters in one summer of Maclean's articles talking about sexual misconduct and how pervasive rape was in the military. Nothing was done, or nothing of significance.
It's really unfortunate.
That is very unfortunate. And then so there's a lot of agencies that were established to cope with sexual misconduct, and one of them is the Canadian Armed Forces Sexual Strategic Response Team, Sexual Misconduct. So for short, it's CSIRT-SM. And in their latest report, they wrote that they viewed before 2014, they viewed sexual misconduct as isolated incidents that happened frequently in the Canadian Armed Forces.
That's an interesting way of phrasing it.
That is an interesting way of phrasing it, right? And so it is, and the problem is that you might have seen while reading those reports is that we don't see much improvement either between 2016 and 2018.
Yeah, it's true. And I guess this Operation Honor may have been their attempt at doing that. Do you think it's really doing much, though?
I am very skeptical of Operation Honor for many reasons. So, first of all, think about the name. Honor. What does it say about how the Canadian Armed Forces view women or men who have been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted in their midst? It's people that have lost their honor. It's people that have lost their dignity. It is very demeaning for victims. Or because a lot of service members don't like to use the term victims, they prefer the term survivors. So it's very demeaning. Also, among cadets and the reserves, at least from what I've seen then, they call it the hop on her.
What was that? Hop on her?
Hop on her.
Oh.
Yeah, so it started being the targets of a lot of jokes and sexualized jokes that are considered sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Yeah.
And another thing, actually there are two other things. The third one is that they focus on perpetrators, criminals. But they don't want to talk about the dynamics that might trigger sexual violence against women, particularly, or gender-based violence. Because we have to remember that women are not the only victims or survivors of sexual misconduct. Men are also survivors of victims, and women can be perpetrators.
Yes.
But the higher rates that women experience that, not only in the Canadian Armed Forces and Canadian society, says a lot about gender perception and misconception and how we tend to see sexual misconduct in general and gender-based violence. So just focusing on perpetrators and just weeding out the bad people, it's not gonna work. And also that idea that it's just criminals that happen to be in the Canadian Armed Forces kind of clashes with the idea of changing the culture that former Justice Marie Deschamps has observed to be highly sexualized and hostile to women and LGBTQ members. So there is that problem. And finally, my supervisor, Dr. Alan English, who is very known in the Canadian military community because he was a teacher at the Canadian Forces College and now he teaches military history at Queen's. He did a study of Operation Honor since 2016 to 2018, and we compared it to my study of gender integration in the Canadian Armed Forces during the 1990s. What we have seen is that the Canadian Armed Forces lack strategy. They don't really have a plan. They have very good PR, but what you can see from the reports is that there is not substantial change. I do agree with the former Vice Chief of the Defense Staff, Paul Winnick, and the current Chief of the Defense Staff, General Vance, that culture change takes time, but that in 2 years, despite teaching their service members about sexual misconduct, reporting sexual misconduct, the fact there is not much change in the statistics says a bit about the problems that are remaining. What are your policies? And every time it's the same thing. They don't meet their target. They have goals eradicating sexual misconduct in the military, but they don't tell you how they're going to do it. Yeah. And focusing on victim support is excellent, and they are trying to do it, and they're doing more every day, but you need to attack the origins and have a plan to attack these original points that create gender-based violence and exacerbates gender-based violence in the Canadian Armed Forces.
And I want to focus our attention now on the last topic I want to talk about, and that's mental health. It's a factor that affects both active, veterans, men, women, basically everyone. So I found some interesting stats. Depression is reported to be the most common disorder, but things like PTSD, anxiety, they all have their fair share as well. Across the board, though, for mental disorders, they occur at higher rates within women. Sometimes only a marginal edge when compared to men, but the pattern still holds. Men, on the other hand, though, they do have a higher proclivity for alcohol abuse. Why do you think these trends occur, and does it signal that men and women need more tailored solutions when they retire, as we talked about before?
So, yeah, once again, I'm going to approach this in a very critical approach. Because,
that's good. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, think about it. Men, it is more acceptable for men to be heavy drinkers, like in society, especially Canadian society, because you might hear it, but I come from France, and I was kind of surprised by the drinking culture here in Canada.
Oh,
you
okay.
You guys drink a lot. I'm sorry. I know that in France we have We have a culture of drinking wine, and I'm from the Belgian border, so I have family that drinks a lot of beers. But
Yes.
there is that culture of binge drinking, even among older people, that is not present in Europe,
Mhm.
or at least in my country. But also, what I've noticed is that it seems to be more socially acceptable for men to drink more than women. And especially when you have fraternities and stuff like that, you see that there's more of a drinking culture, heavy drinking culture among men. Now you duplicate that in when you go in an organization that is male dominated, that has a very masculine culture, and that takes a toll on your mental health. Because serving in the military, whether you're admin or whether you're combat arms, it's difficult. It asks a lot of your time. It asks a lot of sacrifices for you and your family. And also it asks you sometimes, like, these people experience a lot of difficulties in their families because of their service, because they're highly dedicated to their own work. And so I believe that all of these factors make men more likely to drink heavily
Yeah.
because of the culture that we have. And also inside the Canadian Forces, there is the TGIF, thanks God it's Friday, or TGIT, thank God it's
Yeah.
Thursday,
Yeah.
where you can drink a lot at the mess, and it's part of socializing. And also that I will tie that back into gender integration and sexual misconduct, is that a lot of women in the not a lot, but I would say a significant number of women, I would say a significant non-negligible number of women avoid social events because they have been harassed, because there's a lot of banter that is sexualized, and so they avoid those circumstances and those environments. Therefore, they don't fall into that culture of drinking alcohol that seems to be pervasive in the Canadian military. As well, tying it back to mental health, being a minority is not easy. And in the military, it adds to the difficulties of being in a very demanding organization. So that these are suggestions, these are my thoughts. It's not something that I've looked at in depth. And I actually, 2 days ago, I am studying attitudes towards women's integration in the British Army. And I found that study of sex segregated data on alcohol abuse in the UK Army. And so I'm going to look into that, and maybe I will be able to come back with you with some more concrete leads.
Yeah, it's really cool. And I kind of want to finish on what my thoughts are about this integration thing. I think it's amazing because it really is just adding more firepower to your artillery. You become stronger. Not including women, it segregates 50% of the population. It's basically a waste of productive resources that could be being used to make the army better, more efficient, and whatnot. And even if you don't want to buy that argument, from a strictly selfish point of view, you would want a stronger military, and that's one way to do it. So to me, it's a great initiative, and it makes a lot of sense.
So you need to think about it in several ways. So first of all, you're absolutely right. And in fact, in the world, and also in Canada, women are the majority of the population. In Canada, we're 51% of the population. So you're actually like restricting most of your population from serving. The problem is that when you perceive women to be weaker physically, and I had to combat some ideas among women as well, that we're weaker. It's not true. We have different skills. So because the military is so entrenched in the idea that they need to be effectively in combat, operationally effective, the fact that women have lower physical capabilities, that scares them, because it is not about bringing more people, it's about being more operationally effective. So if you think about it that way, if you think that women are weaker than men, you don't have that incentive of integrating more women for the sake of having more people.
Well, here's my counter argument to that though. I think that argument was more true decades and centuries ago when combat was actually more focused on just physically dominating people, like before the advent of guns and technology, stuff like that. In today's day and age, maybe it plays a part still, but to me, it's dwindled. The effects of that kind of mindset don't really add up to me because there are numerous ways to be effective in the military without having to go fist to fist.
So the thing is that you're absolutely right, but you need to think about the culture in the military and the people who are still there. A lot of the leaders were, a lot of the leaders in the Canadian Armed Forces were part of the Canadian Armed Forces before the end of the Cold War, where the Cold War was, as you may know, very my button is bigger than yours kind of mentality. And so there was that idea that you had to be stronger on the ground. But even today, with Afghanistan, with Iraq, even though there has been a shift in more recent years, but after 9/11, there has been a comeback of that very hyper-masculine idea of the military, because you had to fight terrorists on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Things have evolved. But also, I would like to push back against the idea that because warfare has changed and because we rely more on technology, now we can include more women. There is that fine line that as a feminist I walk, and I'm engaging in debates because I really want to find a way to better articulate that. But in Canada, the idea of soldier is very tied into the idea of citizen. And so why don't we include women just because they're a citizen as the same level as men?
Yeah, I agree with that. I just
Why
think
do
there's
we have to argue why women would be operationally effective? Especially that today we're talking about how women are more peaceful, how women are more nurturing, so that's why we need them in the military. This is highly problematic as well. But at the same time, you
before we move
cannot.
on though, I actually want to just touch on that. So there's multiple ways to go about justifying women in the military, right? And to some people, what you stated is correct. Just because they're citizens, that's fine. But as you alluded to yourself, some people don't have that same train of thought. So if you have other reasons why you can justify it, such as the effectiveness, to me, it's just adding more pros to the equation. It doesn't have to be dumbed down to just one point. You know what I mean? There's a lot of good reasons why, and maybe certain reasons appeal to different people. It's really about diversifying the reasons why you can justify your decisions.
Oh, I completely agree. I do agree, but it is a fine line to walk, because I am a strong believer, because my research was focused on how gender integration is a culture change, is that how you frame the discussion to be appealing for people, not to increase the number of women, but also to be more embracing of diversity in general, because of a variety of experiences, different ways of thinking. And this is why I don't necessarily agree with the discourse that we're using today, when we're like, oh, women are more peaceful and they lead to more successful peace agreements and stuff like that. So first of all, Dr. Stephanie von Arlaki, who is the supervisor of the Gender Lab, suggested that saying that puts a lot of pressure on women because it makes them responsible for the success of an operation.
No, I agree. I'm actually not even 100% in agreement with that claim. I think it's a pretty foolish claim as well. So
I do agree with that as well, but it is also a gendered role, because we were taught, as women, we were taught to be nurturing. Look, we grew up playing with dolls, right? And to be like, we always talk about women as mothers and stuff like that. But to go back on the point that women as being more peaceful is not the perfect way of, or women bringing softer skills to the military. To me, it's not the right way of approaching it. And I think that maybe what would be better is that you will be more operationally effective, because you might be able to think your operations in a more holistic way.
Yeah, and that's actually exactly the point I was making.
Yeah, it is like more embracing of things on the ground, and things that I'm sorry, I'm gonna say it bluntly, but a bunch of white dude might think on the ground. But it is the same problem if it was just a cohort of white women, right? Or a cohort of any demographics. As long as it's homogeneous, you won't be holistic in your approach to things. So that diversity, whether it's gender integration or increasing the numbers of people that are from minorities, it is that idea that you might bring different perspectives, and that is what will make you more operationally effective, because you will think about things that you haven't thought before.
Yeah, I actually 100% agree with that. That's a great end goal. I feel like there might be a disagreement in terms of the path there, though, because you painted this picture of a group of white people or a group of black people, a group of women, whatever. To me, race and gender don't define the way you think, though. Like, if the end goal is to have diversity of thought, that's a good thing to screen for. But there's no telling what a group of 10 random white people mixed with 10 random black people might think. They could just have the same ideas as well, or 10 men and 10 women. It seems to me that race and gender aren't barriers that fixate you on a way of thinking. So my main point is, if the goal, which I think is a good one, diversity of thought, well, we should be tailoring our approach to that.
The thing is that what I think you might be overlooking, Marco, is the fact that society is gendered, society is racialized, so that impacts our experiences in different ways. Like myself, as an upper middle class immigrant woman, I won't have the same perspective as another white woman in Canada, or an immigrant white man in Canada, or a racialized immigrant.
But here's the thing, though. It's not about your race. It's more about the class you grew up in. See, this is something I think that people are overlooking.
No, it's also, but the problem is that you need to look at it both ways. Is racialized people tend to be in lower economic status. It is a fact. You can look at the statistics. And so it shapes, all of those are intersectional identities that you need to look at.
Yeah.
Because and it's the same thing whether, like, if you're a person of color that happens to be queer or trans, like all those factors change because society doesn't respond to your identity in a uniform way.
Here's the thing, though, that I think is being overlooked. Like, you've identified the truth, but it's been mixed in a little bit. So the fact that you mentioned that these minority groups are a member of the lower income class at rates that are higher than other groups. So the key difference there is the environment in which you grew up in. That's actually what's affecting the way you think. If you pick a random minority and a random other person, they might think the same just because they have a different race or gender. That's not the crux of it. The crux is the environment in which they grew up in, is what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, no, and I'm not conflating the two. I'm saying
Because it feels
that
like it is being conflated.
your identity and where you're coming from impact the environment in which you grew up.
I agree with that, but it's to different degrees, though. It's what I'm trying to get at is that you've identified a goal. Diversity of thought on the field is beneficial, correct?
Yeah.
So what I'm trying to tell you, though, is that diversity of thought doesn't just come from your race or from your gender. It's the ways in which you've been growing up in, and those are actually more impactful. If you take a black man and a white man who've both grown up in high income households, they're likely to have a very similar experience. Or take a white man, a black man who've grown up in low income households, they're likely to have very similar experiences and ways of thinking. So I'm not trying to take away from the perspective argument. I actually agree with it, but it seems the way we're targeting it is not the most efficient.
The problem is that you overlook the fact that Black people tend to be discriminated against in society. It doesn't matter their socioeconomic status.
It's not entirely overlooked, though, because what I'm trying to get at is that you don't know. You really don't know if that person.
You don't know, and this is why
exactly.
we actually agree on the same point.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It's just that I'm more inclusive of identity when it comes to experiences of people. And it is because I am someone who has studied post-colonial history, that has studied critical feminism in the context of international relations. So this is the background in which I'm coming from. And to me, your identity impacts your experiences in society. They might be similar, but they're still different. And even two white person from high income might not think the same way, because
exactly.
you can be
That's the point. That's the point, though. Is what I'm trying to get at.
no, and but the problem is that when you go in the military, and that because the military, the thing is that you're being socialized a certain way, and so when you get those young people that just, because people join the military for very similar reasons, like even women. They joined for financial reasons, because they didn't know what to do after school, because they wanted to have some money for their education, and poof, they ended up never leaving. Or some of them went to the military because they had a toxic childhood. But at the same time, you're being socialized in a certain way. And because the Canadian Armed Forces has been a male-dominated, very heteronormative and white organization, that shapes the way you're being socialized. And it creates a certain uniformity of thought that we need to think about. And bringing diversity of thoughts in the Canadian Armed Forces is not only a question of bringing people in, but it's also rethinking the relationships and the way you socialize your members within it.
Yeah, no, I agree. Diversity of thought should be the goal. It just feels like there's more efficient routes to approach it. So before we end off our discussion, do you have any final thoughts you want to give to the audience?
Ooh, there are so many. But I will cut it to the gist of it. Change in the Canadian military is not going to be generational. And it is the same thing for the experiences of service women. It's getting better. Yes, progress are being made, but progress is being made because there are people pushing for change. It is not just by sitting there and hoping that young people will take over for us. It's not going to work, because the people in leadership, people that can actually impose policies that can lead to effective change, are the people who are born in the environment in which women are marginalized or other thoughts are marginalized. So we really need to take that into account. And we need to advocate. We need to push forward from the grassroots, as you mentioned earlier, if we want leaders to finally listen to us. And I think that society tends to overlook the Canadian Armed Forces, but we really need to push the leadership for change to happen.
Yep. Thanks for joining us, Charlotte. It was really a pleasure to have you on, and I look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you for having me.
We'll see you soon.